Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Nicole, and today I'm going to be talking about what I have been reading in the last week. I'm going to start with the two books that I finished this past week, and the first one I'm going to discuss is Augustown by Kei Miller. This takes place in 1982 Jamaica in Kingstown in the neighborhood that is eventually called Augustown. And this tells the story of Ma Taffy and the trouble that follows her grandson Kaya home from school one day. This was a really good and surprising book for me. It's a book that I've had on my TBR and I have owned for a very, very long time. Probably one of the oldest books on my shelves, just in terms of how long I've owned it. And I was happy to finally pick it up. I don't know why I've put it off for so long. It's actually a relatively short book. And so I was glad to finally get a chance to read it. Now, this is a book that I have described as being magical realism, and it's so interesting that that's how I described it, and that I just recently did a video on magical realism, because in reading this book, I came across this amazing quote that I think also very fittingly describes what this book is about. So let me read that to you real quickly. Look, this isn't magical realism. This is not another story about superstitious island people and their primitive beliefs. No, you don't get off that easy. This is a story about people as real as you are, and as real as I once was before I became a bodiless thing floating up here in the sky. You may as well stop to consider a more urgent question. Not whether you believe in this story or not, but whether this story is about the kinds of people you have never taken the time to believe in. So that is a sample of the writing in this book, and it is such a tightly written and plotted story, and it just has so many unique features to it. And also it kind of, like, I feel like threw some shade on me for calling it magical realism, though in reality I did not think this was going to be about like primitive island people or anything like that. I was just going with the traditional name of magical realism, but I love the fact that it even challenges that idea within the story. So, without going into too much detail about this book, I do want to share what my highs and lows were reading this. I will say overall, it was just a whole bunch of highs for me. So, let me talk about those first. So, first of all, I would like to share that I did listen to this book on audio, and I think there are a lot of advantages to doing so. One, there is the Jamaican accent and dialect, if you will, is used throughout this book, and it's written out, I think, pretty well. But if it's not an accent or a dialect that you're familiar with, it can be kind of difficult initially to sparse the words, and you may find yourself spending a lot of time trying to decide how to pronounce something and what some of the sentences mean. So despite the fact that I thought I was going to start with the highs, that's actually one of the lows of this book, is the dialect. But I guess the audiobook was my point, is one of the high points of this. I really enjoyed listening to the audiobook. It brought the language and the accent to life for me, and I think it is a beautiful dialect and a beautiful spoken language and accent. And so it was really just joyous to listen to that in the audio recording. Also, there are a couple of moments in here where a song is mentioned, and in the audiobook version that I listened to, the narrator sung those parts of the song, and that just really added to the atmosphere of the entire book. And that's not something that I would have been able to figure out on my own. And so there were a couple of sung moments that really helped you feel just what it would be like if you were actually there in this neighborhood. Another part of this book that I really enjoyed, like I said earlier, was just the tight plotting of this book. It really moves you along. It's very well paced, and it's just got such an interesting storyline. Even though the characters are a major feature of this book, it really builds up this sense of like impending doom or threat, and everything builds really nicely in the rising action to a very satisfying and disturbing climax. My other favorite part of this is just the characterization. There's some very good character development in here, because you do kind of go back and forth in the timeline of the story. So you get to see a lot of the people like years earlier, or even when they're younger, as well as later in life at the time that this main part of the story takes place. The characters are well developed. They're very interesting, very different people, and you end up feeling like you know a lot of the people in this neighborhood, a lot of the community members, and you get a good understanding of how they interact, for better or for worse. Ultimately, I would recommend this book to anyone who likes character-based stories, even though I just finished saying how I felt it was very plot-driven, and it is. But if you like character-based stories, historical fiction, books that are about family and community and the drama and interaction and in love that's involved in all of that, as well as sometimes the hate and heartache, this is a good book for you. Like I said, it's not very long. It's a very quick and fairly easy to read book that covers some really dramatic times and hard times in Jamaica that if you're not familiar with the history of the island, you may not know much about. It also covers a cultural difference, I would say, that I don't want to get into too much because I feel like there's parts of that that would potentially be a spoiler for the book. So this is a amazing story about a community in Jamaica in 1982. I highly recommend it. I think the only other warning that I would add is that it is a non-linear story. There are definitely time jumps, points of view jumps. It kind of goes a little bit all over the place, and I would say the first chapter regarding that can be a little bit confusing. So I would definitely say stick with the book through at least the first part, because I want to say it's in 2 or 3 parts. And you'll have a better sense of how all these storylines and bits and pieces are connected because you are in a very short period of time going to get a lot of different people's perspective on things. And I'm sorry if you can hear like humming and buzzing in the background. I don't know what is going on. I think they're cleaning the streets or something. I don't know, but it's a really annoying sound, and hopefully it's not coming over the microphone. Anyway, back to this. Augustown was a great read. I gave it 5 stars, and I'm really happy that I read this. And I do think it really like stands up to sort of the promise that is made in that little section of the book that I read you. I do think this is a story that's more than just about magical realism. It is about the people in the story and about a story which you may not have ever heard of or in people you may have never believed in. The next book I read this month is The Lacuna by Barbara Kingsolver. This tells the story of Harrison Shepherd, and it takes place starting in Mexico and then traveling back and forth to some extent between Mexico and the US from 1930 to the 1950s. And it covers very heavily the time period and discusses very heavily the entire circumstances to some extent surrounding the Red Scare in the US. It's a very interesting historical time period that this book covers. It is a work of historical fiction, and I would say that ultimately this book is about family and who is someone's true family and love and finding that family and home, as well as about finding yourself and your true identity. And thirdly, I would also say this book is about the power of words. And so, again, I'm going to share a quote from the book that I feel like very much emphasizes that point. Any 2 words spoken in haste might become law of the land, but you never know which two. And that idea is very much at the heart of this book, even though it talks a lot about art and social justice and the power of art. It most particularly talks about over and over and over again the power of the written word as a art form, as well as a way of social justice, as well as the personal aspects of that and social aspects of that. Some of the highs of this book include the setting of it and like just the historical background and place that it occurs in. Like I said, part of this book takes place in Mexico. I learned about a lot of things that were happening in Mexico in the 1930s and 40s that I really just didn't have a lot of information regarding. There is some discussion about like some of the ancient history of Mexico in here as well, and that comes up throughout the book. And then finally, there is a lot of discussion, as I mentioned, about the sort of build up to the Red Scare in the US and sort of how and why that happened. And it kind of gets very gently shaped within the book and comes more and more to the forefront as you go along in reading it. Barbara Kingsolver's characterization was also a really good high for me. She had a lot of really well-drawn, interesting characters throughout the book. One of my favorites being Frida Cole, but not just her character alone, but the interaction that she had Frida have with Harrison in the book, who is a fictional person. But she was able to characterize both these people in a way that she would take historical figures and they would come to life and they would feel real to you. And they would feel like, yeah, this possibly is what this person was like. At the end of the day, for me, that really made me want to read more about Frida Cole, as well as Diego Rivera, who is her husband, or was her husband, and just their relationship and all of that. So I feel like a huge like Frida book project coming on. I did have quite a few lows with this book, however, one of them being I felt like the pacing wasn't always great. Um, there was definitely sort of structural problems or plotting problems in the book. And I don't know that the theme always came together cohesively because I do feel like I spent probably 2/3 of the book going, what's the point of this? Like, where is this story actually going? It felt kind of like there were 2 or 3 different stories that were trying to be told until you finally got like one narrative and one sort of plot direction. And to me, it didn't feel intentional. It felt like just like accidental editing didn't like correct that or bring it together. There were some parts of this book where you got stories of one setting or one time period in Harrison's life that I felt like we just went into too much unnecessary detail. Not that they were parts of the story you didn't need to hear about. I didn't feel like that happened. It just felt like she lingered on some points in his life way longer than you needed to. And there were maybe 1 or 2 small moments that I feel like maybe we didn't need to know. It almost feels like a Bildungsroman or a coming of age story, but not quite enough. So all of those things together kind of made like that part of the book a little more shaky than I felt like it should have been. Probably my biggest qualm with this book was actually some of the writing style. It was really all over the place for me. At times, there were points in this book, and you will see I did annotate it or tab it, that I thought her writing was really good and she had some beautiful phrases. Overall, though, I felt like a lot of the sentences were very stilted, very short and simple and almost childish in writing style at points. At one point, he is younger in the book, but it almost feels like he's super young, but then it kind of gets explained away. But that also kind of just feels like an editor told her to either fix it or explain it away. So I didn't necessarily like her writing style in this book, just in terms of like the syntax a lot, which is kind of surprising. That's not usually something that I like struggle with. And it wasn't a struggle, it just wasn't necessarily as pleasant as it could have been, or I feel like it should have been given the age of the character throughout the book. Additionally, there were a lot of heavy use of metaphors and similes, and sometimes they worked, but I felt like the vast majority of the time they did not work because they were over explained. I just felt like she didn't trust the audience to be able to unpack any of the metaphors that she was using, even though some of her metaphors were used over and over again. I will say I really enjoyed the last third of the book. I feel like the plot and the theme finally came together very strongly and really kind of worked itself out. There became like one particular setting in the book where Harrison lived that I really enjoyed and was able to finally like settle into the story. But ultimately, I felt like it was kind of too little too late for me, and that I don't know how invested I would have been in this book if I wasn't buddy reading it. So, for all those reasons, I ended up giving it a 3, but it's kind of an uncomfortable 3 for me, I will admit. This is one of the books that I will say I've read this year that has made me question whether next year I want to start giving like half stars to things, because a 3 for this feels too low, but a 4 feels way too high to me. And that brings me to what I am currently reading. The first book I will talk about is Brandon Sanderson's Warbreaker. This is the first book by Brandon Sanderson that I have ever read, and I'm not too far into it. I am listening to it mostly on audiobook right now, though I'm going back and forth about whether I want to switch to a physical edition of this. I haven't decided yet. So far as I can tell, I would describe this as being a book that, one, I know is a standalone that the author seems to be trying to make into a series. So I don't know if that's going to happen, but I'm glad it was written initially as a standalone so that I don't have to worry about reading the rest of the series. And one of the things that I constantly hear about this book is that it has a unique magic system, and thus far, I would say that's true. The only other thing that I could comment about at this point is that I would say that the trope in here is kind of that fantasy novel where you have sort of two warring kingdoms. That seems to be sort of one of the main aspects of the background of this story. The writing style is something that really interests me because I've heard a lot about Brandon Sanderson's writing style and how people really love it. And I'm finding that his writing style reminds me of somewhere between Lonnie Taylor's writing style in Strange the Dreamer, though not quite as like floral as some people would describe it. And it also reminds me even more so of the writing style that you get in the Legend of Ellie Monpress. Um, yeah. So I feel like the writing style and some of the things that are like happening just in terms of the characterization remind me a lot of those two books. We'll see if that holds up as I go through it, but they're definitely two books that very quickly came to mind while reading this and would probably, depending on how this goes, be other books that I would recommend if you like this one. But again, I'm not too far into the book, so we'll have to see what I think by the time I'm done. I expect I will probably finish this book in the next week, even though the audiobook is very long, but we'll see. The second book that I am currently reading, and this is a book that I have a physical edition of, but may switch with the audiobook of Warbreaker. I don't know, I can't decide. But it's Oscar and Lucinda by Peter Carey. And this is what I would describe as somewhere between a historical fiction and literary fiction. I think it reads more historical fiction like than something super literary. This is another book that I would say is maybe a coming of age story. It covers the story of Oscar and Lucinda, two people who we are starting to see grow up, or maybe at that turning point where they're coming of age or have come of age. I don't know, hard to figure out so far. Um, but it tells their story as they struggle between figuring out who they are versus who people want them to be. And they have two very different struggles with that. There, it does seem like there's potentially some like, gender role reversal going on here, which would be interesting because I want to say this takes place in the early 1900s. I don't know that we've actually been given a time period yet. But structurally, it's interesting in terms of how it's set up because we do have the two different POVs, kind of. And the reason I say kind of is because the point of view of this whole book is actually a narrative that's being told by the great granddaughter of Oscar. But she is sharing a story with us, the reader, or whoever she's telling the story to, about Oscar and Lucinda. And she is kind of an omniscient narrator because she's able to go back and forth and tell the story of both their lives, even though, as of right now in the book, their lives are not connected in any way. So that is a really interesting, fascinating part of this book. It's kind of a story within a story. And I do have a quote from this book that I would like to share that I feel like also kind of highlights one of the key themes that I'm finding in this book. And at this point, this is in Lucinda's story, and she is talking to a gentleman who she's asking her to help her with her large inheritance that she has just received. And she kind of wants to buy this place and have this guy kind of oversee her finances as it evolves. I am jealous because the drop is yours, not mine. Because more than that, you can enter the glassworks. Through the main door, just as you may, he says. But I cannot, don't you see? They will not treat me with anything but the greatest condescension. And besides, I would be made into the creature they imagined I was. And so this is Lucinda saying this to a man because she truly feels like he has the ability to do things that she would not because this society has this imagination and this idea of who she is and how she's supposed to act. And that is very true in Lucinda's story. And it's very true in Oscar's story in a very different way. And I don't feel like we have the fullness of what the sort of identity crisis is for Oscar. But I feel like in some ways, they're both going to have their own sort of identity struggles. So I think that's a really fascinating sort of backdrop to the story. I don't know if it's going to be the main theme in the story, but I'm kind of hoping it is because I think it's sort of a coming of age topic that I don't feel like I've read a lot about that recently, or certainly not one that I've seen so forward in the story, if that makes sense. So that is everything that I am reading this week. And I have to admit that after the Lacuna, which took up quite a bit of my reading time last week, I was feeling kind of slumping because I've had kind of like a weird mix of books so far this month, but I was feeling myself just heading towards a massive slump. And I have to say that I am glad that that has turned around. Augustown was a huge win for me. I really enjoyed it. Probably going to be the best book that I've read this month. Oscar and Lucinda is a really good follow up. So I am thanking these two books for possibly saving me from a slump. So that's it for me this week. Let me know how your reading week went. Let me know if you've read any of these books and what you think about them. And I'll talk to you next time. Bye.